Welcome to another edition of Thought Leaders Live, where we talk with thought leaders in business, life, and all points in between. Today, it's a special honor to be joined by Major General Robert W. Nixon Jr. Is now, uh, you got to get that in right. And he is a nationally recognized leadership expert, executive advisor, best-selling author, and the former commander of the U.S. Army's 7th Infantry Division. I'm telling you, I'm just scratching the surface with telling you what he has done and accomplished in his illustrious career. Robert, so happy to have you here. Thank you for joining me on the show.
Well, thanks, Greg. It's glad to be here, and I look forward to our conversation.
So we're going to be talking about leading through chaos, how to be calm in transformative times. And I think before we get started, though, Robert, could you give us a little bit more details about your personal background and your professional background?
Sure, Greg. I mean, I will not say that I was born in a log cabin and walked uphill to school each day. Born in Georgia, lived in Georgia, North Carolina, oldest of 6 kids, and a fairly, I guess you would say, regular life, if it's such a thing. Had the privilege of attending the military academy at West Point, entering in 1970, largely because I wanted to be a college football player at a high level, and I was fortunate to have some of the academic credentials and stuff that they were interested in me as potential Army football player. I entered in July of 70. They promptly discovered that I wasn't as good a football player as they might have thought of. But in any case, I wanted to be a quarterback. I was a quarterback in high school.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And Coach Cahill looked at me in the first summer of tryouts there, and there were about 5 other quarterbacks there who were throwing the ball, 60 or 70 yards from, flat-footed. I could throw it about 20 or 25. And so Coach Cahill said to me pretty quickly in the first day or so, "Hey, Nixon, don't you like defense?" And I said, "Yeah, Coach, I guess I do." And so then I played free safety there in the freshman team. In sophomore year, I got hurt, couldn't play anymore. So my mediocre football career came to an end. But I was in the company of about 1,200 other young men from around the world. 828 of us graduated 4 years later. It was a high attrition rate in those days.
Wow.
We call what I call the culture of compliance, where you did what you were told when you were told. If you're lucky, you got by with it. And went into the Army coming out of the Vietnam War. And I was commissioned in 74. The war ended in 73, and I was in the midst of an Army in chaos. And I say chaos not because we had people that breaking ranks and stuff, but there was a lot of internal problems in the Army in those days, in the 70s. Very, very much so. A lot of Americans blamed the Army for the defeat in Vietnam. We were torn between, or I guess caught between, a draft Army and a volunteer Army. So half the soldiers we had didn't want to be in the Army, really, and the other half, we didn't really want them to be in the Army because the volunteer standards weren't very high in those days. And so you had this, as my father used to say, a dog's breakfast in some ways here of soldiers that you were trying to inspire to perform incredibly important missions. We were patrolling the East-West German border in those days, the 11th Cavalry. And I had some great leaders who stood out, even in the chaos. But there was a lot of chaos. There were drug issues and racial issues and underfunding, under-resourcing issues without enough fuel and ammunition to train with, and yet expected to fight the Third World War. And it would have been all the conditions where you could have just bailed and said, "Well, I'm not doing this anymore." But a number of us stayed in the game and came out of the Army and into the military in the 1980s, where we transformed the Army due to some very thoughtful leadership. At the senior levels, it cascaded into the ranks and developed an Army where we wanted to be in. We were all in. And you saw that in the Gulf War in 1991, where one of the finest armed military forces in the world conducted a classic battle of annihilation against the Iraqi army there in Kuwait. And what we thought was going to be 4 months of war turned out to be 100 hours of war. And it was just an incredible transformation of our military over those 16 years. And I had decided to stay in because I had been inspired by others. Stayed in, served in a number of roles. I was privileged to, teach at West Point for a few years. I was privileged to be a commander at a number of levels. I was privileged to work for wonderful senior officers like General Crosby Saint and General Colin Powell and General Jack Sheehan and you know Hal Estes. I mean, people who just were willing to underwrite a lot of mistakes and teach me uh, what right looked like at a number of levels. Then I transitioned to the corporate world and worked in a couple of manufacturing companies because I wanted to figure out how that world worked, and found out in a difficult pattern in 2008, 2009, the Great Recession. And then I started my own company after that, those adventures, Level 5 Associates, over 10 years ago, and been helping individuals and teams grow leaders who get it, because I've made 99% of the mistakes you can make as a leader, and maybe I can translate some of that to others, and they don't maybe only make 80%. That's what I'm engaged in at this point in time.
Um, can you talk a little bit too about your initiative with veterans?
When I got to Webster, New York in 2009, after a couple of years in a manufacturing company, I met Sankar Siwanath, who was the CEO of CDS Life Transitions there, a 501c3, serving men and women with intellectual disabilities. And I had never been in that environment before. And he and I talked about providing similar services to veterans with traumatic brain injury and post traumatic stress from a community based framework that would complement the VA. And so we embarked on this journey to develop Warrior Salute, which was a program for men and women who had traumatic brain injury, post traumatic stress, military sexual trauma, bring them into a very personalized program using the tools we already had at CDS Life Transitions and building on our expertise of veterans, recruiting some other ones to help us. But we didn't have a large veteran population of staff, but we had a lot of veterans in need, and we were able to complement the VA in that regard. And we just celebrated our 16th anniversary of Warrior Salute. We have a 90% success rate of transitioning into independent living, and we're going to celebrate Warrior Salute success with our annual golf tournament at Oak Hill Country Club on the 20th. And it sold out again for several years in a row. One of the great golf courses in America, but also the ability to raise money for a totally privately funded program that provides life and job transition to men and women in the veteran ranks. And I don't think we can do enough of that, Greg.
It's an amazing, amazing program, and congratulations on its success and all the help you've given to veterans. It's just an amazing achievement. I'm going to take you back to that transformation in chaos, back to the when you began to serve post Vietnam, and as you said, there was all the disruption within the army. Describe to me how you, and I'm sure all the people you serve with, how you engineered that change. Um, and I'm sure it occurred on multiple levels, but tell me a little bit more about that. That sounds fascinating.
Well, I started out as a young lieutenant in the 11th Cavalry Regiment in 1975. I first got to Germany. And one of the, um, I guess you would say, paramount figures in my developmental journey was my platoon sergeant. I was second in command of my 42-person platoon there. And his name was Sergeant Mack. Sergeant Mack was a large figure physically and a large figure leadership wise. A couple of tours in Vietnam, he had seen the elephant, if you will, and as they say about combat. And soon after I got there to the unit, we were working on our vehicles. We had 10 armored vehicles, didn't have enough money for parts and stuff. So we were always trying to scramble to keep them operational because we had to get out the gate in 2 hours because the Russians were only about 10 miles away. And we were in the motor pool working on the vehicles one night as we got ready to leave and march back down to the barracks. He turned to me and said, "Sir, let me see your fingernails." I thought, "Boy, this is pretty insubordinate. I asked me to look at my fingernails. I'm an officer," and blah blah blah. I didn't say any of that crap, fortunately. I showed him my hands. And he said, "Sir, your fingernails are not dirty. So the soldiers are going down the hill. Why don't you and I change the generator in this tank?" And I could have said no. I was 22 years old. I was pretty knowledgeable. Uh, he was 35, 36 years old. And he'd been around the block. And he'd had some dumb lieutenants before, I guess. But this time, I listened. And we got coveralls on and pulled the back off the tank and started working on the generator there as it got dark that night. And the lesson for me was very clear. If you're going to lead soldiers the way they deserve to be led, you got to get your fingernails dirty. Leadership is not about esoterics. Leadership is about practical application of tools at work, and you got to get your fingernails dirty. That made a huge impression on me for the rest of my life, personally and professionally. As Sergeant Mack helped me figure out what right looked like. Later on in the Army, Greg, I was charged with transforming the Army or changing the Army's design while we were at war as head of Task Force Modularity. I was then a general officer, but I had the same kind of experience here where I had about 100 people in my team. We call it Tiger Team. And our task for the Chief of Staff of the Army was to change the Army's fighting formations within 12 months while we were in combat. And that's an incredibly daunting task when you're talking about an institution that has deeply seated resistance to change, just like all of us do. I mean, if you think about it, resistance to change is not something any of us like, but certainly from an institutional standpoint, it was a very, very challenging task. But we were able to do it and create a modular design of the Army, and I think it was more effective. I'm a little biased in that regard, but I think it became more effective as a result of becoming smaller and lighter and more agile. So those are two examples of where I had to think about being the calm in the chaos. Certainly the chaos of a post-war Army and the chaos of an Army at war are different forms of chaos, but they exist today in all aspects of our lives. And my most recent book, The Power of Being All In, I talked about what's happened to us, particularly since 2020, in the chaos of our lives. Professionally, in terms of business and family and community and politics, and religious discord. Where is there not chaos? I can't find it.
Right.
We got to be adaptive leaders who can lead through this chaos and lead it effectively and not just sit around and wring our hands in a positive manner.
Robert, I just want to go back to that transformation period because, you talked about the resistance to change. What was it, do you think, that it allowed you to move everybody from the status quo? Was there something specific that was done, or what allowed you to move forward?
I think first and foremost, Cotter was right. There are 8 stages of change, and you read his books about that. But first of all, you have to get at least a tacit understanding that something different needs to be done. And I don't think anybody in the Army in 2003, 2004, having just been, we attacked on 9/11, then we went into Afghanistan, then we went into Iraq in March of 2003. There was no one in the Army who didn't believe that we were going to have to be more agile to be effective on disparate battlefields against an enemy that was not going to stand and fight, although certainly the Afghans did early in the war, and they got blistered by it. But later on, the tactics of the enemy became, again, adaptive. And, the fighting formations that we had grown up with were no longer as relevant because we were in a battlefield that was much more dispersed, and the level of chaos was different. So we had to adapt to the chaos that we were in. And that's why having smaller, leaner, more agile formations was absolutely paramount to our being able to prosecute the war successfully in Iraq and Afghanistan against enemies who didn't want to cooperate, if you would, if that's the right term, with formation type fighting that had been part of our, or more finite, more classic, if you will, formation combat that we had seen in prior campaigns. So the need for change and the acceptance of the need for change is step one, to answer your question, Greg.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about your Big Six leadership principles and how it helps leaders navigate uncertainty and transformational change.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. I developed 6 principles, and again, not because I had an original thought. I don't think I ever had, but I was, trained and mentored by some brilliant men and women who really, I guess you would say, infused me with the idea that there were 6 principles upon which we could build leadership tools that would work in the chaos that we were living in. The first principle is set the azimuth. What's our true north? What's our mission? What's our intent? What are our values? What are our behaviors to represent those values? And so you set the azimuth as a team. You don't get up as a CEO and say, okay, well, this is now our mission, intent, values, culture. Everybody have a nice day. Because you're not going to get the buy in. And buy in is essential to having a culture of commitment. I talked earlier about a culture of compliance. I think now we have to transition, just as we talked earlier about change, into a culture of commitment if we're going to get the buy in to work through the chaos that we're living in. The second principle is listen. As my mom said, God gave you two ears and one mouth for a reason. Not that I listened to mom. And mom, God bless you. I know you're probably watching or will soon. I'm working on it. I'm working on it, mom. She's 93 now, still trying to get me, as Jimmy Buffett says, within the navigational beacons here. So, listening with the intent to understand, Stephen Covey says, is a skill that most leaders don't have. They listen with the intent to reply. So listen is the second principle because I think it's fundamental to being an adaptive leader in the chaos we're living in. And you got to work at it. The third principle is trust and empower. We have to manifest trust through empowerment. And if we're not willing to trust the members of our team, they're certainly not going to trust us. And in the chaos that we're in, we really need to believe in each other. We got to create conditions where trust is evident in the empowerment and the underwriting mistakes. We used to call sins of commitment, not sins of omission, but sins of commission, because you're trying hard to do the right thing, to follow the azimuth, to listen with the intent to understand, because all 6 are nested here in terms of the principles. The fourth principle is do the right thing when no one's looking. As we used to say in the Pentagon, that briefs well. Well, I live here in Melbourne, Florida, and about a mile from my house. And I get out here on Wickham Road. And I can tell you that the speed limit may say 40 miles an hour, but that has no impact on what everybody's doing out here. As my spouse and other friends will tell me, the speed limit is just a suggestion. So, I see that on I-95 too, by the way. So I think most of us have been there. We can talk about doing the right thing. When it comes to doing the right thing, that's a big challenge. And we work through that principle in our workshops, using the concept of getting through the blind spots that we have, which is a term that has been used by several very, very bright people about our biases and our leadership shortfalls in terms of saying we're going to do the right thing and then not doing it. And what does it take to transition that? The fifth principle is when in charge, take charge. That doesn't mean loud, profane, abusive. It means calm, collected, thoughtful. It means having the capability of tactical patience, where you may not believe that the first report is always right, because it's not. The first report is almost always wrong. And you have that ability to stop and say, okay, wait a minute, team. Where are we going? What's our azimuth here? We're kind of getting outside the Jimmy Buffett parameters here. Let's take a pause. And you can treat people with dignity and respect, and still you can be in charge. I mean, I think people want to respect their leaders. They may not always like their leaders, but they want to respect them.
Right.
You have to earn that respect by being that calm. The sixth principle is balance, the personal and professional. A lot of people believe that balance is about work-life time at work, time at home, time family. Well, first of all, if you read an article about time management, there's a fundamental flaw in that approach, because you can't manage time. Time is finite. So that's not possible. What you can do is take more ownership of the time available and live more according to your values. And what I work with leaders, teams, is how do I achieve that balance in terms of 4 levels of energy: physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual? How do you develop, nurture those batteries in yourself and in others so that you can live according to your values and have more ownership of the time available to you? That's a key component of the big 6, as the other 5 are, and they're all nested. If you think of them together as gears, they're centered around the first person you have to lead is you. And so we talk about that whenever I'm with individuals and groups is, okay, let's start with you. Who are you? What do you represent? And I help people develop a personal leadership philosophy, which is that statement of this is who I am, this is what I represent. And then the big six principles emanate from that source, if you will, of personal leadership of yourself. And then you help cascade that into the leadership uh, characteristics of adaptive leadership, of being all in. And I call it all in adaptive leadership because that's what it takes. If you're going to have a culture of commitment, you got to be all in.
I think people listening, and myself included, when we think of the military, we think of soldiers falling in line. We think of commanders issuing directives and orders, and those orders being followed. And I think it may come as a surprise to people that a lot of the things you're talking about that you experienced in the Army are very similar to a lot of the challenges that people have in the civilian side in companies. Um, is there a difference? And I mean, I just think it's pretty amazing to me that you're saying the same things. I mean, my knee jerk would be like, why are you spending time on this, Robert? You can just tell people what to do in the Army, and that'll happen. Well, why do you think that wasn't the case, and how was it different than in civilian life?
Well, the Army certainly had a more structured environment, a culture, as I talked about the culture of compliance. There was indeed a more structured network and framework of, you had name tags and ranks and positions, and it was structured in that regard. And today, my older son is still on active duty. My two sons both served and have led soldiers in combat. And I will tell you that there are times when they say, "No, we just got to saddle up." Well, I lived in the same world. Time we had to saddle up, and as long as everybody understands that's the deal, then when the time comes, they should be ready to do that. Now, it doesn't have to be the norm. Directing activity in time and space does not have to be the norm. The culture of compliance is still necessary, but it's a component of the environment. The culture of commitment is a broader context. And I learned in the Army that if you don't get the buy-in of your soldiers, you can tell them all day what to do, and they may do it with some degree of capability, but they won't be all in. They won't have bought in to the intent. And the intent is a key component of the asthma. In the corporate world, I think we face the same challenge. You can be directive in many cases, or say we have these directives and we have to be compliant and have regulations. But that doesn't mean people are committed. It means they have to be compliant to certain parameters of the profession, whether it's for-profit, not-for-profit, service, industry, manufacturing. There are going to be some boundaries that are established for compliance. But the commitment is a far deeper level of understanding in the organization of where do I fit? How do I belong? We're all tribal creatures, Greg. We want to belong.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what I learned in the military and transferred in my corporate life was that belonging has to be nurtured. We talked about the band of brothers is very real in the military, brothers and sisters. It is, and it still is. I can tell you that. But we can develop similar bonds in corporate teams. It may not be as the depth may not be as great, but I think I get pretty deep. I still think you get pretty deep, and you can get there by being committed and by walking the talk. And again, the first person you have to lead is you.
Robert, you've seen a lot of different changes over the decades, and I've experienced a lot in the marketing world in terms of how things used to be when I first started as a young copywriter, and how the technology has changed and things have changed over the years. But there's still a lot of fundamental truths that I still adhere to in my role and what I do that still make the difference, even with all these changes. What have you seen in your time that is very different today than maybe when you started out? And what still remains? What are some fundamental truths that you see?
Well, the big six principles are the the touchstones of adaptive leadership. And I think they are enduring. They were enduring 20, 30 years ago. I just hadn't, really explored them to the level that I have now. So those are enduring principles. The application of those principles is where a change is really taking place. And I think that's where all in adaptive leadership has come to the fore. Uh, we simply can't do things the way they've always been done and expect that they're going to be relevant. How many people I talk about that want to harken back to the golden days of yesteryear when giants roamed the earth and this generation was all jacked up. My generation was really good, is really good, and everybody else is sort of screwed up. That goes back to ancient Greeks were writing about that stuff
Right.
1,000 years ago. So it's not a generational issue, it's an adaptive issue. We have to be able to communicate effectively with all the members of our team, uh, in our family, in our community, and in our professional life. How do we adapt without seeming like I'm not talking about coddling people. I'm not talking about lowering the standards of what right is. I'm talking about being able to adapt our leadership style and our method of communicating where applicable so that we can operate effectively in a hybrid world. We can operate effectively in a world where some people are more transitory in their thinking. We have to get folks to buy in, to perhaps break some of that paradigm. I was just reading an article today in the Wall Street Journal about Costco and some members of their team who have been members for decades. And they were able to create that longevity by investing in people very intensively, whether it was a higher wage, um, uh, giving them positions that were more relevant to what they wanted to do and not necessarily putting a round peg in a square hole. And it's a great story to sort of model from or build from in terms of understanding what an adaptive culture looks like. So I think that's where we have to focus is how do we adapt the big six principles through the chaos we're in and connect with the people who are in our tribes so they want to belong and they're going to be all they can be.
You mentioned connection, and I have to ask you this because a lot of the guests who come on this show, the discussions always seem to revolve around or touch on emotional intelligence in some to some degree. And I think, uh, especially from a male culture and perhaps in the military, EQ and soft skills are kind of poo-pooed maybe, and empathy is considered maybe not something that is relevant, especially in combat or in just in the military in general. And I'm just kind of curious your take on the discussion of leaders having empathy and emotional intelligence.
Well, empathy or EQ, as it's called, as you know, Amy Edmondson and some other people pioneered this idea of psychological safety, which is a term I think very, very highly of. You create psychological safety by helping people feel safe to express their thoughts and opinions without being in jeopardy of professional backlash. In the military, as I said, we do seek to listen with the intent to understand. Again, going back to Covey's statement, empathy lives in that paradigm or that framework of listening with the intent to understand. So if we can have leaders who listen more effectively, then they're going to empathize more effectively. And we'll still have to make hard decisions, but we'll make hard decisions with an understanding of other people's perspective. And if we have set the azimuth and we are applying the big six, I think in many cases people will buy in because they realize there's a greater good here. And sometimes our personal ambitions and goals have to be subordinated to the greater good if we're going to be members of the tribe, if we're going to be members of a community where there's a culture of commitment. And we don't want to be outliers. Most of us don't want to be outliers. I talk about that in the power of being all in. We want to belong and we're willing to make the commitment if we know that the leaders in our organization care. It's the old adage about, I don't care how much you know until I know how much you care. Hmm. That's where emotional intelligence also lives.
So, Robert, we've got about a minute left. If there's, and I'm assuming if someone wants to work with you, they could contact you on via LinkedIn. You have a pretty
Sure.
robust platform, and you mentioned before you have a Substack, which I'm really looking forward to reading.
Great.
Um, so if they can contact you in those two ways, if someone is interested in becoming a better leader, what's you give one piece of advice, like one thing you could do to get started down that path right now?
I think the first step is going back to yourself, leading yourself. I think you need to establish a personal mission statement and a personal leadership philosophy. And I'll be glad to help you do that. You can contact me at robert@level5associates.com, spell out the five. And unless I've been seriously incapacitated, I will respond to you. We can start a dialogue about how do I start to lead myself? What does a personal mission statement look like? Personal philosophy. I've helped several hundred leaders do this, and I think that is foundational to then figuring out, okay, how do I apply the big six to myself and people in my world, if you will, personally and professionally. But you got to start with you and start with defining, who am I? What do I represent? What are my values? What are my operating principles? What can you expect of me? Here's what I expect of you. And then I strongly recommend you sign it and date it, because you're making a contract with all the people around you to try to be all you can be. And I think that will increase the buy-in that they have very much, because they realize how much buy-in you have to your journey. So that's my start point, Greg.
Wow, love it. Robert, I just want to conclude by, I don't want it to sound cliche or trite, but when I say thank you for your service, I really, and I've had other military personnel on the show, I hope you really understand how heartfelt that statement is from civilians when we say that to you, and how much we really value your sacrifice and all you've done for this country. So thank you for your service, and thank you for joining me on the show.
Thanks, Greg. I would just ask everybody to remember how many thousands of soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines are on watch for the nation right now, keeping us free.
Okay, thank you. And we will conclude with that powerful thought. And thank you, everyone, for joining us on another edition of Thought Leaders Live. We'll catch you on the next.